I named her before the Velsorin court had finished preparing its list. That detail matters to me still, 3 years on. It matters because what the court heard when I spoke was a woman they had long since stopped counting, and what I heard when they went silent was the specific quality of a room discovering that someone had done reading they did not expect. I will start where the story starts, which is not in the reward chamber. The reward chamber is where it became visible. The story starts 14 days earlier, in a secondary estate on the eastern shoulder of Velkethara Reach, in a room with insufficient lighting and shelves that had not been properly maintained, where a woman I did not yet know was sitting with her back to the door, working through a set of supply manifests, by the light of a single panel that someone had neglected to replace at full output. And the hands holding the documents were doing what the Iran medical designation called a tremor, and what I would later understand was simply the way Vithai Velsorin's hands were. I was in that estate for operational reasons that had nothing to do with her. I was there because the Velsorin secondary estate had become, over the preceding 3 months, a waypoint for a supply chain the compact needed to interrupt, and I had been contracted to map the chain and identify its access points before a formal interdiction team moved in. My tasking was to enter the estate as part of the household maintenance rotation, spend 10 days, file a complete architecture of the supply route, and exit without having disturbed the household's understanding of what had occurred. Standard work. I had done the same category of job 11 times in 9 years. I entered the estate on a Tuesday morning as one of 4 contractors on the maintenance rotation for the Eastern Residential Wing. The cover was clean. I had genuine credentials, a genuine maintenance history filed with the compact secondary posting registry, and a specific work order for panel replacement in the Eastern Service Corridor that gave me legitimate reason to be in most of the estate's administrative spaces. I had spent the prior 4 days reading everything the compact had on the estate: layout, personnel roster, supply chain routing as it was currently understood. 4 days of reading is the minimum I give myself before a posting. It is not always enough. In this case, it was insufficient for one specific reason. The secondary archive room was not listed in the floor plan. I found it on day 2, because the Eastern Service Corridor ran adjacent to a wall that had a different acoustic quality than the corridor on the other side of it. I filed the observation and returned to the area on day 3 during a meal break window when the Eastern Wing was at minimum staff. The archive room had a door that matched the wall paneling and was not labeled. I noted the door, recorded its position, and did not open it on day 3 because the meal break window was not long enough to give me unobserved access. I returned on day 4 with a panel repair order that gave me a legitimate reason to be in the corridor for 2 hours. The door was not locked. I opened it and found a room approximately 6 meters by 4, shelving on 3 walls, a central work table, and a single overhead lighting panel operating at perhaps 60% of its rated output. The shelving held document files in a system clearly maintained to a specific organizational logic, not alphabetical, not by date, but by some cross-reference system that would take time to decode. Sitting at the work table with her back to the door was a woman in administrative service attire. Pale lavender gray skin, copper-dark hair cut close to her head, long neck, the particular economy of posture that belongs to someone who has spent a great deal of time at a work surface and has arranged their body to serve the work rather than to be seen. A set of documents spread across the work surface in 3 distinct groups, which she was cross-referencing with a method I recognized immediately as systematic and careful. Her hands, holding a page at approximately 40 degrees from horizontal, showed a fine oscillation, low amplitude, approximately 12 cycles per second bilateral. I had seen the designation in briefing files before, Velsorin tremor. The documents in official records always described it as a limitation, What I was watching was not a limitation. The woman had tilted the page to the specific angle at which the oscillation produced the least visual interference, was holding it with the finger positions that minimized lateral displacement, and was reading at a rate that suggested the accommodation had become entirely automatic. The tremor was managed. It had been managed for a long time, by someone who had built the compensation into the working method so completely that it no longer interrupted the work. It was simply part of the method. The hands knew what to do without being directed. The eyes were doing something else entirely, which was red. I was in the room for 11 minutes. During those 11 minutes, she did not register my presence. She was fully engaged with the cross-reference. I had time to observe the layout of the documents, to note the manifest numbers on the visible pages, numbers I recognized from the operational briefing, and to register that whoever was working at this table had access to the same documents I had been sent to find, and was doing something with them that the operational brief had not accounted for. After 11 minutes, she looked up. The pale gold eyes ran across me with the quality of someone who does not waste motion in any direction, including the direction of threat assessment. She looked at me the way you look at a maintenance contractor who has appeared in a room you are using, noting the presence, categorizing the function, determining what needs to be communicated. She said, in compact standard that was technically precise and entirely without warmth or hostility, that the maintenance panel replacement had been scheduled for 2 days prior, and she would appreciate accurate information about the timeline. I told her I was on the panel replacement rotation, and the delay was a scheduling cross-reference error, which was true. I told her the replacement would be done within the hour, which was also true. She nodded once. She turned back to the documents. I replaced the lighting panel. From the service position, with a legitimate reason to be at the east wall for 20 minutes, I could read the manifest numbers on all 3 document groups. I had the supply chain architecture partly in hand by the time I closed the panel cover. When I left, she did not look up. That evening, back at the maintenance contractor's transit quarters on the estate's west side, I filed the first portion of my operational observation record, noting the archive room location, the document access, and the manifest numbers. Then, separately, I ran a query against the estate's household registry. The query was not part of my tasking. It was not something the compact coordinator had asked for. It was a thing I did because I had spent 11 minutes watching someone do careful work in a room where no one had apparently thought to replace the lighting panel at full output, and I wanted to know the full account of who that person was. The household registry returned, Vithi Velsorin, second daughter of the Velsorin sovereign house. 31 standard years. Current assignment, secondary estate administrative function, archive management and supply documentation. Velsorin tremor designation, congenital upper grade affecting fine motor function bilaterally. Notation, formal incompatibility factor under the Velsorin succession pairing charter. Secondary notation, not eligible for sovereign pairing consideration. Tertiary notation, current assignment indefinite. 3 notations, a medical designation, a pairing exclusion, and an indefinite assignment to a secondary estate archive room with a malfunctioning lighting panel. I read the record 3 times, not because the language was unclear. Because the gap between what the record described and what I had watched in that room for 11 minutes was the kind of gap that deserves careful attention. The record described a liability. What I had watched was a woman who had built a compensating method so complete and so automatic that her working pace was not distinguishable from someone without the tremor, who was cross-referencing 3 sets of documents in a system of her own design, who had registered my presence and issued a precise request without any performance of distress or management of image, and who had turned back to her work before I had finished processing what she had said. I have a habit, professional in origin and personal in practice, of noting the gap between what official records describe in what I observe. The gap is usually informative. Sometimes the record overstates capability and the observation corrects it. Sometimes the correction runs the other direction. In 14 years of contractor work, I have found that the second correction is more common than it should be, and that the places where a record most consistently undervalues a thing are the places that deserve the most careful attention. I noted the gap. I did not file it in the operational record. I went asleep. The following 9 days were work. I completed the panel replacement rotation in the eastern wing, which gave me documented access to every service corridor and legitimate reason to be in the administrative spaces on multiple occasions. I mapped the supply chain access points with the thoroughness the brief required. I identified 12 distinct routes, 4 primary staging locations, and 2 secondary access points that the prior survey estimate had missed entirely. The operational report was going to be solid. I wrote it in my head during the maintenance shifts and filed it each evening in pieces. I crossed the archive room's threshold twice more during those 9 days, both times with legitimate maintenance cover. The first time she was not there. I had 20 minutes in the room. I read the visible manifest numbers, noted the cross-reference system's organizational logic in detail, confirmed that the document set represented a complete picture of the supply chain routing if you knew how to assemble it correctly, and left. The system she had built was elegant. It cross-referenced by function rather than by document type, which was not the standard administrative approach, but was considerably more useful for identifying operational patterns. It was the kind of system that someone builds when they have been given a document set and no instructions and decides to make the document set useful anyway. The second time she was there, working, the same posture, the same 3-group cross-reference method, the same management of the tremor. She looked up before I reached the service panel, which meant she had registered the door opening. She said, without preamble, that the cable housing on the east wall secondary conduit ran behind the archival shelving, and if I needed access to it, I should let her know before the maintenance window rather than during it, so she could clear the shelf. I said I would let her know. She said, returning to the documents, that this was an improvement over the previous contractor's method, which had been to pull the shelf away from the wall without notice and leave it misaligned for 4 days. I said I could see how that would be a problem. She said the problem was primarily that the misaligned shelving altered the angle of the ambient light from the overhead panel, which affected document legibility at certain reading angles, and she had been managing estimation for those 4 days, which introduced error into the cross-reference she had been completing at the time. She said she had identified and corrected the introduced error after the shelf was realigned, but the correction had required 3 additional days, which was 3 days the work should not have needed. I thought about that specific accounting. The alignment of shelving affecting light angle affecting document legibility, affecting cross-reference accuracy, and then the additional days of correction work, all stated without complaint as a factual chain of cause and effect. She was not telling me this because she was unhappy. She was telling me this because it was accurate, and because she expected accurate information to be acted upon. I said that misaligned shelving altering the document angle and introducing error seemed like a reasonable thing to be specific about. She looked up at that. The pale gold eyes ran across my face with a different quality than before. Slower, more precise, with the attention of someone who has heard an observation land in a place it does not usually land. She said, yes, with the flatness of someone who has stopped expecting observations like that one to be made. I said I would make sure the shelf was cleared before and realigned after. She said, all right. I cleared the shelf. I accessed the conduit. I realigned the shelf afterward to within 2 millimeters of its marked position, which I had noted before moving it. I spent an additional 20 minutes confirming the wall panel was operating at full output, which it was. When I left, the light in the archive room was as good as it was going to get in that space. She did not comment when I checked the panel. She was reading. She did not comment when I realigned the shelf either, though I had the sense she noticed the accuracy of the realignment, because the quality of her attention to the document she was holding changed slightly at the moment. I set the shelf back into position. I completed the operational architecture on day 10. The full report went to the compact interdiction coordinator, and from there to the Velsoran Sovereign Court in a standard formal briefing, because the supply chain ran through Velsoran territory and the court had formal jurisdiction over the interdiction response. Under the standard compact operational contract, the contracting party is entitled to offer a reward to the operational contractor for work that fell within their jurisdiction and produced actionable intelligence. The form the reward takes is typically an asset register presented at a formal ceremony, from which the contractor selects. I was given 4 days between the briefing and the ceremony. I used them to read the full Velsoran bonding charter. The charter was publicly available through the Compact Cultural Documentation Archive. It ran to 47 pages including the secondary provisions. I read all 47 pages twice and the secondary provisions 3 times. The third subsection of the secondary provisions contained the Velsoranath Acknowledgement Protocol. The formal address a Velsoran House member could speak to confirm a bonding consideration as a genuine personal choice, rather than a compliance with court mandate. The address had a formal structure: a statement of personal observation, a statement of personal naming, a statement of personal commitment. The receiving party's response formula, if the consideration was accepted, was a 3-part reception in compact standard or equivalent: acknowledgement of receipt, confirmation of the recipient's position, and a statement of sustained standing. I read the response formula 3 times. I memorized it. I did not expect to need it in the reward chamber. The reward chamber was where I would make the request. I expected to need the response formula later at the estate after I had heard what she said. The reward ceremony was held in the central hall of the Velsoran Sovereign Palace. Pale stone floors polished by several centuries of formal occasions, good ceiling height, the specific acoustics of a room designed for proceedings that do not require a raised voice. Sovereign Valen Velsoran at the front, his senior advisor Preen Velaruth at his right with the asset register, his court in the appropriate positions. Perhaps 60 people total, not all court members, household administrators, compact liaison representatives, the standard composition for this category of event. Preen Velaruth read the register fully and carefully. Survey rights in the Velsoran Eastern Territory, 20 standard years with a renewal option. Priority contracting status with the Velsoran Court for 15 standard years, encompassing both standard maintenance rotations and any compact authorized special operations work within Velsoran jurisdiction. A resource allocation package representing a substantial portion of one of the smaller Velsoran mining installations. A personal housing allocation in the Velsoran capital, in a district I understood from context to be considered prestigious. These were not small assets. The court had prepared a serious register, calibrated to the actual intelligence value of what I had provided. Preen Velaruth finished reading. She held the register at the position that indicates readiness to receive a selection. I let the silence settle for a moment, the way you let a silence settle when you want it to be clear that you considered the register carefully and have an answer that is not hasty. Then I said, "Vithai Velsoran." The room went quiet in the particular way that rooms go quiet when what has happened is not in the range of what was expected. The silence had texture to it. It had the texture of 60 people registering in real time that I had named a person rather than an asset, not a survey right, not a resource allocation, a person who was not on the list. Preen Velaruth said, with genuine composure and genuine professional effort, that Vithai Velsoran was not in the asset register. I said I was aware of that. She said Vithi Velsorin was the second daughter of the sovereign house, currently assigned to secondary estate administrative function, and had not been placed in the reward register. I said I understood. I said I was requesting that the court consider a bonding consideration, which was within my rights to request as an alternative to the listed assets, under the Compact Operational Contract's Third Appendix, Clause 11. I said I understood the consideration would require her agreement as its primary condition, without which it could not be formalized. Clause 11 of the Third Appendix was a provision most compact contractors did not know existed, because most contractors did not read the full contract. I had read the full contract. The room had the texture of a stillness that contains more than one thing happening inside it at the same time. Preen Velaruth said, carefully, that the Velsorin tremor designation was a formal incompatibility factor under the succession pairing charter. I said I had read the full charter, secondary provisions included, and that the designation described a fine motor oscillation affecting document handling at certain wrist angles. I said I had observed the subject working with the designation for approximately 32 minutes across 4 encounters, and that her compensating method produced no functional error in the work output. I said the designation was, from an operational standpoint, describing a feature of her working methodology rather than a limit of her capability. Preen Velaruth began to say something about the succession pairing charter. I said, I am not asking about succession. I am asking about a bonding consideration. The room had a different quality to its silence now, longer, the specific quality of a room reconsidering something. Sovereign Valen Velsorin looked at me for a long time. His gold eyes were doing what I had seen his daughter's gold eyes do, taking in information, running the assessment, allowing the assessment time to complete before the conclusion was stated. There was something in his face that I did not have a name for at the time. I would later come to understand it as the specific expression of a man who has been carrying a decision for 23 years and is now watching someone else arrive at a different conclusion from the available evidence, which is always interesting to watch regardless of what you think of the conclusion. He said, with the flatness of a man who genuinely wants the answer, why? I said, I watched her work. In 14 days at your secondary estate, she was the most competent person I encountered. I read the household registry record and I understand the court's designation. I disagree with the court's accounting. There was another silence. This one was different in texture from the first two, longer and less certain in its direction. Preen Velaruth made another attempt about the Velsorin tremor designation and the succession pairing charter. I said I had read the full clinical record, not only the administrative notation. I said the clinical record listed compensating methods that produced no measurable accuracy degradation in document-based work, and that the administrative notation did not include this information. I said I disagreed with the administrative notation because it was derived from an incomplete reading of the clinical record, and that my observation of the subject working confirmed the clinical record's conclusions rather than the administrative notations. There was a silence in the room that had a new quality to it entirely. It was the silence of 60 people absorbing the fact that a contractor had read not just the household registry, but the full clinical record, not just the standard contract but the third appendix and its clause 11, not just the bonding summary but the full charter and the secondary provisions. The silence had the specific texture of a room discovering that the person it thought it was dealing with had been, for the entire duration of this interaction, several documents ahead of the conversation. Sovereign Valen Velsorin said, with weight that was not formal, Vithi would have to consent. I said, of course. He said he would send word to the secondary estate. I said I would go myself if the court permitted. He looked at me for a moment longer. He said the court permitted it. I went. The relay transit took 2 hours. The eastern approaches to the secondary estate were visible through the transit vehicle's window for the last 20 minutes of the journey, a flat shelf of land with the estate's low walls at the far end of it. I spent the transit reviewing the secondary provisions in my memory, confirming the response formula was in the order I had memorized it, and thinking about the quality of the archive room, the full output lighting panel, the 3 document groups, the hands at the precise angle. The estate staff was expecting a visitor and showed me through without delay. The household administrator who escorted me had the expression of a person managing strong surprise with professional competence. I noted the surprise and did not comment on it. The archive room door was ajar. I knocked on the frame. She looked up. The pale gold eyes ran the information-gathering pass, categorical first, then slower and settled. She said the maintenance rotation had been completed, and she was not expecting a return visit. I said it was not a maintenance visit. She said, "Go on." I told her what I had said in the reward chamber. Not the silence, not the procedural argument about Clause 11 or the shift in the sovereign's face when the calculation completed differently than he expected. Just what I had said, that I had watched her work, that I had read the registry record and understood what the court's designation meant, and that I disagreed with the court's accounting of it. That I had read the full bonding charter, secondary provisions included. That I had asked the sovereign to permit a bonding consideration, conditioned entirely on her agreement, and he had agreed to consider it. She set down the document she had been holding and placed her hands flat on the work surface and listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, without performed emotion, only accuracy, that the Velsorin tremor designation had been part of every formal accounting of her worth since she was 8 years old, that it had been the answer to every question about her future for the 23 years since, that the secondary estate assignment was not a posting with an expected end date, that she had learned to work within those facts because there was no alternative to working within them. I said I understood that was the history. She said, "What changed it?" I said, "I did the reading and I disagreed with the conclusion." She looked at me. The pale gold eyes were running the slower assessment, the check against the interior standard. She said she needed to think. I said I expected that. She said I should sit down. I sat in the chair on the near side of the work table, which had the quality of a chair that is not often used, and for the next 2 hours we were in the archive room. Some of it was silence, the particular working silence of 2 people who are both occupied and neither of whom is performing the occupation for the other's benefit. Some of it was questions she asked in the order they mattered to her. She asked whether I had read the full clinical record or only the administrative notation. I said I had obtained the full clinical record from the compact medical archive. She said what it said. I said it described a bilateral fine motor oscillation of congenital origin, upper grade on the assessment scale, with an estimated functional impact on document handling at specific wrist angles, and that the functional impact section listed the compensating methods available, and noted that regular users of the methods experienced no measurable accuracy degradation in document-based work. She said that notation was in the full clinical record. I said yes. She said it was not in the administrative summary. I said correct. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, without bitterness, with only the precision of a fact that has been held for a long time, the court used the administrative summary. I said yes. She asked about the bonding charter. She asked whether I had read the full charter or the summary provision. I said the full charter, secondary provisions included, twice, with the secondary provisions 3 times. She said which subsection contained the Velsorinath Acknowledgement Protocol. I said, the 3rd subsection of the secondary provisions. She said the 3rd subsection was not in the publicly available summary. It was available through the compact cultural documentation archive, but required a specific subregistry request. I said I had submitted the subregistry request. She was quiet. She said, "You submitted the request before the reward ceremony." I said yes, 4 days before. She said, "You read the Velsoranath acknowledgement protocol before you went into the reward chamber." I said yes. She said, "Including the response formula." I said yes 3 times. The pale gold eyes had gone from the slower assessment to something I did not have a precise name for at the time, though I would later come to know it well. A quality of recognition that ran deeper than the methodical scan, carrying the weight of something that had been pending for a very long time and had now found its referent. She said, "You went into that room prepared to receive the Velsoranath." I said, "I went into that room prepared to make the request. I came to the estate to hear what you said." She was quiet for a long time. The archive room held its ambient quality around us. The overhead panel at full output, which I had set to full output during the second maintenance visit. The documents on the work surface. The specific quality of a room used for serious work for a long time by someone who takes the work seriously. She said with a flatness that was precision rather than distance, that she would need to think about the consent. She was not saying no. She wanted to be accurate. I said that was fair. She said, "Why do you disagree with the court's accounting?" I said, "Because I watched you work and I read the clinical record, and the administrative notation is inaccurate. The administrative notation describes a capability limit. The clinical record describes a compensating method that addresses the limit. The method is effective. You have been using it for 23 years. The work you produce is accurate. The accounting is wrong." She said, "That is an operational argument." I said, "Yes, it is the argument I can support with evidence." She said, "Most people would make a different kind of argument." I said, "I make the argument I can support." She looked at me for a long time. Then she said, with the careful precision of someone arriving at a conclusion they want to state exactly right, "You are a person who reads the relevant documents." I said yes. She said, "The relevant documents were the clinical record, the bonding charter, the secondary provisions." I said, "And the household registry." "And the manifest numbers visible from the service panel position, and the full operational brief." She was quiet. I said, "You reconstructed the supply chain architecture from unlabeled manifests." I was watching. She said, "I know, that is what I mean." She stood and walked to the window, which looked out onto the estate's inner courtyard. Pale stone pavers, a low wall at the far end, a climbing plant currently producing small pale flowers in the afternoon light. She stood at the window and looked at the courtyard. Then she spoke. She spoke the Velsoranath in the old tongue, the formal acknowledgement protocol from the 3rd subsection of the secondary provisions. 3 components in the old tongue that I had read in translation, but had not heard spoken aloud. The cadence was formal and deliberate, and underneath the formality carried the full weight of something personal, which is what the secondary provision said it was for. In a working translation it ran to this: "I have seen this person. My house names this person, and I name this person not because the court has recorded a worth and I am accepting the record, but because I have assessed the worth myself and I find the record incomplete." She finished speaking. She was quiet. I said in compact standard, in the order I had memorized, "I receive this. I stand as I am, without condition or reservation, in the position you have named me." She looked at me. The pale gold eyes had the quality of a calculation confirmed. The result expected, the confirmation arrived, the moment of allowing the confirmation to register. She said very quietly, "You knew the response formula." I said, "It was in the secondary provisions." She said, "You went into the reward chamber knowing you would need it." I said, I went into the reward chamber prepared. I came to the estate to hear what you said. She said, you knew before the court had prepared its list. I said, yes. She said, before Preen, Vela Ruth had read the assets. I said, yes. I had 14 days and I used the time. The reading was not ambiguous. She said, the court thought they were offering you a choice. I said, yes. She said, you had already made it. I said, the choice was in the secondary archive record and the clinical notes and the full bonding charter. I read those. The choice followed from the reading. She looked at the climbing plant. She looked at me. She said, with the flatness that carried its full weight underneath it, no one has ever made the choice before the room was ready. I said, I had 14 days. 14 days is sufficient time for careful reading. She said, I know, that is what I mean. She called to the household administrator, who had been maintaining a professional presence in the corridor outside the archive room door for the past several minutes. He entered with a notation form and the expression of a person doing professional work under genuinely unusual circumstances. He was a man of about 60 with the bearing of someone who has managed formal proceedings for a long time. He completed the required entries. The Velsoranath had been spoken. The response formula received, both in the proper forms, one witness present. Date, time, specific location. Then he said, not in his official notation voice, you knew the response formula. I said, it was in the secondary provisions. He said, I have administered 12 Velsoranath proceedings in 40 years. No receiving party has ever known the response formula. I said, the secondary provisions are available through the compact cultural archive. He said, no one has ever requested them. I said, I submitted the sub-registry request 4 days before the reward ceremony. He was quiet for a moment. Then he completed the final entry on the notation form and said the bonding consideration would be formalized within 3 days pending sovereign ratification. Vithai said the ratification request should note that the contractor had submitted the sub-registry request 4 days before the reward ceremony, and that the response formula had been delivered from memory in the correct order and the correct form. She said the record should be complete. He said yes, second daughter, and left. We were alone again in the archive room with its full output lighting and its shelving system, and its 3 groups of documents on the work surface. I said before I left, the supplemental note. She said yes. I said, you asked what I would have done if you had refused. I would have filed a supplemental operational note with the compact coordinator regardless, noting that the secondary estate archive room contained an analyst who had independently reconstructed the supply chain architecture from unlabeled documents in approximately 8 weeks, and recommending the coordinator consider a formal engagement. She said, you would have tried to correct the record even if I had said no. I said it was an inaccurate record. Inaccurate records are worth correcting. She was quiet for a moment. The courtyard held its afternoon quality outside the window. The climbing plant moved in whatever air moved through the estate at this hour. Then she said, I know, that is the thing I mean. 3 days later, the sovereign's ratification arrived. It was formal and brief, and its closing sentence in the working translation read, the contractor demonstrated thorough preparation prior to the reward ceremony and made a selection reflecting competent and careful assessment. The court ratifies the consideration and enters it in the Velsoran House record with the notation, choice made before the list was read. I kept that sentence. It is a precise description of what occurred, and I find precision satisfying when it appears in official documents. The following week I submitted the full operational report supplemental, which included a formal recommendation that the compact coordinator consider engaging Vithai Velsoran as an intelligence analysis contractor. The recommendation cited the supply chain reconstruction timeline, 8 weeks to complete architecture from unlabeled documents, and noted it as 9 days faster than the prior estimation baseline. It noted the 3 supplemental access points she had identified that I had missed, 2 of which materially altered the interdiction approach. I submitted the supplemental under both our names. The coordinator's response ended with, "Accurate preparation." I sent a copy to Vithi with a note, 9 days faster than the baseline, 3 access points I missed. The formal record should reflect accurate information. She replied, "The 3 supplemental access points were identifiable from the document set. You had access to the same documents. The gap was in the analysis time, not the documents." I replied, "Noted. I will revise the supplemental accordingly." She replied, "Do not revise it. 9 days faster is accurate. I worked 8 weeks. The baseline was 11. File the accurate number." I filed the accurate number. 3 years later, I still think about the reward chamber. The texture of the silence when I said her name. 60 people, a formal occasion, the asset register being read, and then a name that was not on the register, and the silence that followed it with the specific quality of a room discovering that the person in front of them had done reading they had not expected. I think about the 11 minutes in the archive room on day 4, the light at 60%, the 3 document groups, the hands tilted at the precise angle to minimize the oscillation. The specific fact that she was building the supply chain architecture from documents that were not labeled as supply chain documents, in a room that nobody had maintained properly. And she was doing it 9 days faster than the baseline, and in a cross-reference system that was considerably more useful than the standard administrative approach. I think about the gap between the administrative notation and the clinical record, and what it means for an official document to be technically accurate in its description and entirely wrong in its conclusion. I have thought about that gap in other contexts since then. It is not an uncommon gap. It appears wherever official records are maintained by people who are not reading all of the available information before writing their conclusions. The fix is straightforward. Read all of the available information. I think about Vithi in the courtyard, 3 days after the Velsoranath, standing beside the climbing plant in the early light, saying, "You knew before the court had prepared its list." Yes, I had 14 days and I used them. She was worth knowing. I read what was written about her, and I read what she was in a room where no one was watching her, and the reading was not ambiguous. So I said her name before the list was read. She would say, if asked, that the answer was already in the documents, that a person who reads the relevant documents will find the answer the documents contain, that the Velsoranath was not a surprise because the Velsoranath was in the secondary provisions, and the secondary provisions were in the cultural archive, and the cultural archive was publicly accessible to anyone who submitted the subregistry request. She would say, "He submitted the request 4 days before the reward ceremony. The record reflects accurate information." It does. She is correct about all of it. She is, as she generally is, entirely accurate. What she does not say, because it is not the kind of thing that goes in an official record, is what it felt like to have been in the administrative notation for 23 years, and then to stand in the archive room in the afternoon light, and hear the response formula come back in the correct order and the correct form from memory, from a person who had read the secondary provisions 3 times and decided that the preparation was the relevant kind. I do not ask her to say it. I know what it felt like from watching her face in that moment, in the room where no one was performing anything for anyone, when the pale gold eyes had the quality of a calculation that has confirmed what it was expected to confirm and is allowing itself, quietly, to register that the result is correct. I named her before the list was ready. I had done the reading. The choice was in the documents. The rest, as the sovereign's communication had it, follows. I have not said enough about the 4 days before the estate posting. 4 days of reading is the minimum I give myself, but in this case, I want to describe what the reading actually looked like, because it is relevant to the question of how I knew. The compact file on the Velsoren secondary estate ran to 93 pages, of which approximately 60 were directly relevant to the operational tasking. The supply chain documentation was clear. The access point mapping was incomplete but workable. The estate floor plan had the issue I have mentioned, the missing archive room, and also had two smaller gaps that I noted and planned to investigate. A service access in the northeast quarter that was not connected to any listed maintenance corridor, and a storage designation in the southern wing that listed contents inconsistent with the estate's documented use. I flagged both gaps for investigation during the posting. The archive room turned out to be the relevant one. The storage designation in the southern wing turned out to be a wine cellar that had been reclassified at some point and not updated in the central registry, which was useful information for the operational map, but not otherwise notable. The personnel roster was where I spent most of my 4 days. 43 staff members listed by function, which is the standard Velsoren administrative format. The household administrator, the estate coordinator, the kitchen and maintenance staff, the archive and documentation function. Vithai Velsoren was listed under documentation function, third entry with a notation that read, Secondary Estate Permanent Assignment, Archive Management. The notation, Velsoren Tremor Designation, followed in parentheses, which is also standard Velsoren format for staff with listed conditions. I read the notation, looked her up in the household registry, and found the 3 notation account I described. Then I ran a subquery against the compact medical archive for the full Velsoren Tremor clinical record, which is a public document, and read it. The full clinical record ran to 11 pages. The compensating methods section was on page 7. I read it, and then I read the administrative notation again, and confirmed that the administrative notation had not incorporated the compensating methods section at all. The notation was derived from pages 1 and 2 of the clinical record, which described the designation's parameters, and had not continued to page 7, which described the designation's management. This is not unusual. It is the single most common documentation failure I encounter in official records, records derived from the beginning of a source document without reading the remainder. Page 7 is on page 7. You have to read to page 7. Some people do not read to page 7. I read to page 7. When I read the personnel roster, I could not know that the person listed under documentation function, third entry, was going to be cross-referencing supply chain manifests in an unlabeled archive room on the east side of the estate. I could not know she had built a cross-reference system of her own design that was considerably more useful than the standard administrative approach. I could not know the light would be at 60%, or that the tremor management was so automatic it had become part of the working method. What I could know from the 4 days of reading was that the official record was derived from 2 of 11 pages of a clinical document and had therefore missed the majority of the available information. The official record was incomplete. The person described by the official record was described incompletely. I made a note to that effect and went to the estate. The posting confirmed what the reading had suggested. The archive room confirmed it more clearly. 11 minutes of watching confirmed it beyond any reasonable doubt. This is what I mean when I say the choice was in the documents. The documents contained the information. The information was sufficient. I read the documents. The choice followed. There is one more thing I want to say about the reward chamber, specifically about the moment after the silence. I had said her name, and the room had gone quiet, and Preen Velaruth had said Vithai Velsoren was not in the register, and I had made the argument about Clause 11, and the operational observation, and the inaccurate administrative notation. And then Sovereign Valen Velsoren had looked at me for the long time I described, and something had shifted in his face. What I had not registered at the time but understood later was what that shift was. It was not surprise. He was not surprised that someone had named his second daughter as a reward. He was not surprised that someone disagreed with the court's accounting of her worth. He had, I think, spent 23 years being aware that the administrative notation was derived from 2 pages of an 11-page document, and that 2 pages of 11 was an incomplete reading, and that an incomplete reading was an incomplete conclusion. He had been aware of the gap between the administrative notation and what he himself had observed of his daughter working for 23 years. He was surprised that a contractor had read to page 7. That is what the shift in his face was. Not that the challenge was being made, but that the challenge was being made by someone who had done the reading, someone who had the documents behind them, someone who could, and did, name the specific section of the clinical record the administrative notation had failed to incorporate. I did not know this at the time. I know it now, because in the years since the Velsoranath and the formal ratification, I have come to know Valen Velsoran in the way you come to know someone who is, in the formal structure of the thing, the sovereign father of the person you have bonded with, and in the practical reality of the thing, a man who has been reading documents carefully for 50 years and who therefore understands, in a way that some people do not, what it means to do the reading. He told me once, over the plain working meal that his household serves in the informal dining room of the secondary estate when he visits, which he does twice a year, that he had reviewed the full clinical record himself when Vithai was 8 years old. He had read to page 7. He had seen the compensating methods section and its conclusions about accuracy degradation. He had brought this to the court's attention, and the court had said the administrative notation was standard practice, and the succession pairing charter used the administrative notation, and therefore the administrative notation was what applied. He had disagreed with this conclusion. He had continued to disagree with it for 23 years. He had not been able to change it, because the charter used the notation, and the notation was standard, and the court had the authority to maintain the standard. He said the reading was not the problem was the room. I thought about that for a while. I said, the room in the reward chamber was ready to be changed. It was the right occasion. He said, yes. It needed someone who had done the reading and had the contract clause and had the observation and was prepared to say the name before the list was ready. I said I had 14 days. It was sufficient time. He said it was sufficient. It was exactly sufficient. That is the point. We ate the plain working meal. Vithai was across the table, reviewing a compact analysis file she had been working through since before I arrived and intended to finish before the evening, because the file was due in the morning, and she preferred to complete things before they were due rather than at the deadline. Her hands held the page at the angle that managed the tremor. The light in the informal dining room was set to full output, because that is how the secondary estate lights are set now, in every room. Valen Velsoran watched his daughter work for a moment. Then he said, not to me and not quite to her, with the quality of someone stating an accurate thing, 9 days faster than the baseline. She did not look up from the document. She said, 11 weeks was the baseline. I completed it in 8. The differential is 3 weeks, not 9 days. He said, the compact operational brief had a prior survey estimate of 9 days beyond your completion time. She said, the prior survey estimate was using the standard administrative cross-reference method. My method is more efficient. The comparison is not informative. He said, the comparison is in the official record. She said, the official record reflects accurate numbers. It does not claim the comparison is informative. The numbers are accurate and the record is complete. He looked at me. I said nothing. The informal dining room held its usual quality, which is the quality of a room where work is done and people speak accurately to each other, and the light is at full output. He said, she has been correcting incomplete records for 31 years. I said, the habit appears to be consistent. Vithai said, without looking up, The documents contain the information. Someone has to read to page 7. We finished the meal. She finished the file before the evening. The sovereign returned to the capital the following morning. I stayed because the work I was doing at the time had its base at the secondary estate, which is now the primary estate for purposes of our operational function. The archive room still has the same shelving. The cross-reference system is still hers, still organized by function rather than by document type, still considerably more useful than the standard administrative approach. The light is at full output. That is the complete account. I named her before the list was ready because I had read the documents, all of them, to page 7 and passed it, and the reading was sufficient, and the conclusion was not ambiguous. The choice was in the documents, the rest follows.